Hello, my name is Lisa Wood. I am a curator at the Ohio History Connection. I work primarily with manuscripts and historic film and photographs. This exhibit is titled Ohio Women Vote 100 Years of Change. It is a traveling exhibit that is going to be going all over the state of Ohio throughout the year 2020 to public libraries, universities, and pretty much any venue that people are interested in hosting. It is designed to be not a chronological story about history, but it is designed to really tell the story of the women's suffrage movement and activism in women's own voices, and to show the diversity of women that have participated in the suffrage movement and women's activism over the years. Suffrage, that word, when we're talking about women's suffrage, we're talking about the organized effort for women to get the right to vote. And that started in the United States around 1848 with a convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And then women quickly moved to having suffrage conventions in other parts of the country. The second Women's Rights Convention was held here in Ohio in 1850. So Ohio women throughout that long fight for the right to vote were very, very involved. They were very active in Ohio as suffragists. There are also a number of Ohio women that got involved in the national suffrage movement as well. This is the first panel in the exhibit, and it gives a historical background and an introduction to the suffrage movement. One thing that's really important to remember is that the 19th Amendment was an important victory. It took 72 years. They started in 1848, and it was 1920 before the 19th Amendment was ratified and women were able to vote in all elections in every state all over the country. However, it didn't guarantee the right to vote for all women. It guaranteed essentially the right to vote for white women. In southern states, African Americans were still disenfranchised, and there were other minority groups such as Asian Americans who were not necessarily citizens and didn't have paths to citizenship until after World War II. There were American Indians who were not all citizens. There were Latino women who were barred for voting in different parts of the country. So it was still many years before all women could truly vote. The 19th Amendment is a big step towards guaranteeing that women that were part of ethnic minority groups would be able to vote when the right to vote for their groups were secured. So it's important to keep that in mind. It's also important to keep in mind the other idea behind this exhibit is that the beginning is 1920. It took 72 years to pass that amendment, but that was just the beginning. Women wanted to vote because they were adults and citizens and it was their right. However, they also wanted to vote because they believed when they could vote, it would confer power. And with that power that they could do a lot of different things. They could pursue higher education, they could run for office themselves, they could found social and cultural organizations. There were already some women pursuing higher education with the right to vote. Their ability to go out into the public sphere and just essentially do what they wanted and really impact the world and change the world to make it a better place for women, for children, for everyone. They wanted the right to vote for a reason. It confers power and authority. So once the 19th Amendment passes, that's the beginning. That's the beginning of change. And they don't stop for a minute. Once the 19th Amendment is passed, they immediately form the League of Women Voters. They begin fighting for all sorts of different causes. It was just after 1920, was just a few years after World War I ended, so many of the women became involved in peace activism because they were horrified by what happened in World War I. They lobbied very hard to pass a bill called the Shepherd-Towner Maternity and Infancy Act, and it was the first time the federal government had ever earmarked funds for infant and maternity care. It was the first time ever that anything like that was funded by the federal government. They didn't stop for a minute to start pursuing these other causes that they felt were important. Anti-lynching was another cause that many women activists were involved in. And this whole exhibit is meant to represent that long story from the beginning of organized activism for women's suffrage in 1848 up to the present day, you know, the women's marches and present day activism. So each exhibit panel poses a question, a broad question about women's experience, and then it features a diverse group of women from each panel, some from the 1800s, some from the 1900s, some from 21st century, that speak to the question. And not all the women on the panels answer the questions the same way. For example, the first panel starts out very basically with what does it mean to be a woman, and it includes, again, women from the 1900s all the way to the very present. One of the important women on this panel is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a former slave, and after she was freed, she traveled a lot giving speeches against slavery and also for women's suffrage. And her most famous speech she gave at a women's suffrage convention here in Ohio in 1851. And there was a refrain from that speech, "Ain't I a woman?" That is not necessarily what she said. There are newspaper accounts that record from the 1851 that record her speech differently, but that "Ain't I a woman?" question, that was actually written down by Frances Dana Gage. Frances Dana Gage was the president of that convention, and later in the 1860s, the convention happened in 1851, and newspapers reported the speech in 1851. Later in the 1860s, Frances Dana Gage wrote a different version of the speech that included the "Ain't I a woman?" question, and that's actually the version of the speech that we remember more. But it's more likely that what Sojourner Truth said is, "I is a woman's rights," and she was just trying to make the point that a black woman and a former slave was, you know, as much a woman as a white woman or women who had very different life experiences. So what we're trying to do is allow the women's voices to shine through and answer the question on each panel. But Sojourner Truth, she was originally from New York but traveled through Ohio. Frances Dana Gage lived a good portion of her life in Ohio. All the women on the panels have some connection to Ohio. Some are very famous, some are not. On this panel, we have Frances Dana Gage again because she is so very quotable. We also have a quote from Amelia Bloomer. She, for a while, published her newspaper, The Lily, in Mount Vernon, Ohio, and she was very famous for the Bloomer pants that she wore for dress reform. And you can see there's a picture of Amelia Bloomer in the Bloomer pants. So as I mentioned before, there are some very famous Ohio women who were involved in the suffrage movement at the national and state level. We were always on the forefront of what was happening. Another very famous woman who is from Ohio, though she mostly didn't live here as an adult, is Victoria Woodhull. Here she is giving an address to Congress in 1873 about women's suffrage. And that was when her affiliation with the suffrage movement was short-lived, but she was very glamorous and very famous, and she brought a lot of attention to the suffrage movement when she was involved, and she was the first woman to directly address Congress regarding suffrage. And then another famous woman from Ohio, Florence Allen, she was the first woman to be elected as a judge in Ohio and the entire country. And prior to running for office as a judge, she was an extremely active suffragist. Moving along to some different panels about how women speak out and how they experience discrimination. There's some other very interesting women featured. Oberlin College is in Oberlin, Ohio, and was one of the first colleges in the country to accept both women and African Americans. And because women had this educational opportunity in here, we had women coming from other parts of the country to attend Oberlin College who became very well-known activists. One of them was Lucy Stone, who came from New York and attended Oberlin in the 1840s. And another was Mary Church Terrell, who moved from the South to go to school first in Yellow Springs, Ohio, and then to Oberlin, where she graduated from college. Lucy Stone was one of the most famous suffrage speakers. She traveled all over the country as a suffrage speaker and was very well paid for that. And then Mary Church Terrell founded an organization called the National Association of Colored Women. She was one of the founders and major leaders of that organization. And eventually she lives as an adult in Washington, D.C. And she got involved actually in picketing the White House for suffrage during World War I. So there are two very prominent women whose Ohio connection is their shared alma mater, Oberlin College. Another really famous Ohio woman that sometimes people forget is from Ohio is Gloria Steinem. She's there on the bottom. She grew up in Toledo, Ohio before moving on primarily to New York, where she's lived for a lot of her life as an adult. But Gloria Steinem is very much an Ohioan as well. One of the things that the women talk about on these panels is the difficulty of women speaking out in the public sphere, and also Mary Church Terrell as an African-American woman, and this lady Constance Curtis Nichols, a civil rights activist from Columbus. They both talk about how they are fighting a dual battle, not only fighting sexism and fighting for suffrage, but also fighting discrimination because they're African-American. In addition to women experiencing different kinds of discrimination, there are also lots of issues that they work for in addition to women's rights. Here we have Mary Church Terrell talking about the importance of education, and Joyce Beatty is talking about her interest in guns rights and curbing guns and curbing gun violence in the country. Natalie Clifford Barney, she is a woman that was a very well-known writer in her day, and she was also a lesbian, so she talks about the, working against discrimination against the LGBT community as well as sexism. And then women talk about how they support each other and inspire each other. That's something that we find a lot in women's writing. Gloria Steinem, for example, was inspired by her grandmother, Pauline Steinem. Pauline Steinem was a suffragist from Toledo. She served for several years as the president of the Ohio Women's Suffrage Association. And when she was president, she headquartered the organization there. She was also the first woman from Toledo to run for school board. Before women could vote in 1894, they got the right to vote in school board elections and run for school board in Ohio, so we were considered a partial suffrage state. And Pauline Steinem in 1903 was the first woman to run for school board in Toledo. And she won because the women worked together. And that's something that Gloria Steinem talks about as, inspiration for her, but also a good lesson for everyone. It was because her grandmother organized women to go to register to vote together and to go to the polls together in groups that she was able to win. So that's an important lesson. And it's something I think we see in the contemporary activist movement as well. Rhiannon Childs, who led Women's March Ohio and who appears on several panels, she talks about being inspired by her mother and wanting to do this activism work for her daughter. You can see here the panels continue with more examples of women inspire one another and their work builds on each other. And ultimately, what you see, what does all of this activism lead to? What does the passage of the 19th Amendment and all the work women continued to do once they had the right to vote, what does it lead to? It leads to a place where women can do a lot of different things. We have Jerry Mock, who flew around the world. We have Judith Resnick, who became an astronaut. We have Maya Lin, a famous architect. We have Simone Biles and Rose Lavelle, two very famous athletes. Rose Lavelle was on the women's team that just won the World Cup. Simone Biles is one of the most possibly the most decorated gymnasts in the world. We have women just succeeding in all walks of life, athletics and science, but none of these pursuits, were necessarily considered within women's realm or women's sphere in 1848 when they held the first women's convention. Their achievements are still remarkable, but now we don't stop to think, can women do that? We know they can. And this is what over 100 years of organized women activism has led to. The final panel about what women would say to future generations of women and activists. And I would say there are probably some lesser known people on this panel. There's a woman named Hallie Q. Brown, who is a professor at Wilberforce University, a historically black college in Wilberforce, Ohio. And she was representing the country overseas, attending international women's conferences in Great Britain at a time when she wouldn't necessarily have been able to attend women's suffrage conventions held in the United States if they were held in a segregated southern city, for example. And so she was fighting that dual group of sexism and racism. But she has one of the most inspiring quotes about, speaking not to black women, but to the women of the country and reminding them to be determined and to have perseverance. Ultimately, that's what all women who worked in the suffrage movement and who are activists now, that's something that binds them all together, is determination and perseverance. I mean, they can be disappointed, but they can't stop. That is what keeps them, ultimately what keeps them going, and thinking about future generations, what keeps them going. Another woman here, she was an interesting woman as a journalist. Georgia Hopley was breaking ground professionally. Also, she was the first female prohibition agent. So her work for suffrage also allowed her to push forward in very male-dominated careers. And in addition to suffrage, she also worked for temperance, which means she was working against the sale of alcohol and outlawing the sale of alcohol, which is very interesting. Katie Smith, who was a well-known Ohio State Buckeye basketball player and is now a very prominent coach in the WNBA. She has a very inspiring message for younger women. And again, we have a message from Rhiannon Childs, who's been involved in organizing women's marches, and a picture from one of the recent women's marches that reminds us that this is an ongoing story.